Two white police officers had tied a black man to a street lamp in the middle of town, turning him into a public spectacle. They thought it was just a joke, but they had no idea they had targeted the wrong man. What happened afterward not only cost them dearly, but also left the entire community shaken. This story isn't just about injustice. It's a lesson in resilience and justice. Let's start from the beginning to uncover the full story. Don't forget to share where you're watching this and subscribe, so you won't miss more inspiring stories to come. William Johnson stepped slowly through the towering doors of the police station. His footsteps echoed across the tiled floor, each one striking through the heavy air of the room. The crisp, new uniform of the police chief clung to his tall, broad frame, with the badge gleaming brightly on his chest, a symbol impossible to ignore. The room fell silent immediately, every gaze turning toward him. The murmurs and chuckles from moments earlier evaporated, replaced by shock. Jack Peterson and Mark Harris, two officers leaning in the corner, initially paid no attention. They continued joking, recounting the ridiculous stunt they'd pulled the day before, tying a stranger to the street lamp in the town square like some cruel performance for the whole town. "Did you see his face? I've never seen anyone look that desperate," Jack said, roaring with laughter, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. Mark, bulkier and more menacing, slapped Jack on the back and added in a low, smug voice, "I told you, don't bother with him. He's not someone we need to worry about." But then Jack noticed the eerie silence in the room. He turned his head, and his eyes widened in terror. Standing before him, in full police chief uniform, was the very man they had toyed with the day before. Jack's face went pale as if he had seen a ghost. Mark, still grinning, turned around. The confusion on his face quickly shifted to unease, and then outright panic, as the realization hit him. William stood motionless in the center of the room, his cold, piercing gaze sweeping across each person in the station. His eyes, like a razor-sharp blade, commanded silence and attention. When his gaze finally landed on Jack and Mark, the tension in the room became unbearable. Not a single person dared to breathe too loudly. What are you doing here?" Jack stammered, his voice stripped of its former bravado. William didn't answer immediately. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving theirs. The silence stretched, thick and ominous, like the calm before a storm. In his mind, William recalled why he had taken this job in the first place. A few weeks earlier, he had received the call. The voice on the other end was serious. "William," it said, "I have an offer for you, but I need you to understand. This won't be an easy assignment. That town, it's not like the others. We've had issues there in the past, and frankly, I'm not sure they're ready for someone like you." Sitting in his small room, William had stared out the window, pondering the weight of those words. He knew exactly what "someone like you" meant. A black man stepping into a position of authority in a town still fractured by racial prejudice was no small task. But he hadn't hesitated in his response. "That's precisely why I need to do it. If we don't make the change, who will?" With a clear goal in mind, not just to serve as police chief, but to bring justice and respect to everyone in the community, he had accepted the challenge. Now, standing in that room, face to face with the men who had humiliated him, he was resolute. Returning to the present, William's eyes burned with quiet intensity as they locked onto Jack and Mark. Finally, he broke the silence. "It seems," he said, his voice cutting through the air like steel, "that we have a serious problem, gentlemen, and you two," he paused, emphasizing each word, "are at the center of it." The room collectively held its breath. No one dared to speak, not even Jack or Mark. They stood frozen, their eyes darting away, but the fear in their expressions betrayed them. They now understood that the man they had mocked and demeaned yesterday was their superior today, the one with the power to decide their fates. Jack tried to muster the courage to speak, his voice quivering as he stammered, "Who? Who are you?" William took another step forward, his voice low and commanding, yet unshakably firm. "I'm the man you should never have crossed." The room was so silent that even the ticking of the clock could be heard. Jack and Mark, visibly shaken, had completely lost their swagger. William's icy stare pinned them in place, rendering them speechless. Standing tall and unwavering, William knew this was the moment. This was the beginning of the change he had come here to ignite, and he was determined to see it through. William vividly remembered the day he arrived in this small, quiet town, tucked away amidst the rural backroads of South Carolina. The atmosphere was starkly different from the bustling cities he had worked in before. Instead of crowded, energetic streets, this town seemed stuck in a time capsule, as though it belonged to a bygone century. The buildings lining the main street were weathered and faded, their paint peeling in places, but they stood sturdy, bearing the weight of a long history. A large sign reading, "Welcome to Fairhope," hung at the town's entrance, but the sentiment didn't match the reality. Driving down the main street, William felt the eyes of the locals on him. These weren't curious, welcoming glances for a newcomer. They were cold, probing stares. Without stepping out of his car, he could tell what they were thinking. He doesn't belong here. William parked his car in front of a small diner in the heart of town. The faded sign, Fairhope Diner, hinted at decades of existence. Thin smoke curled up from a chimney at the back, and the air carried the comforting scent of toast mingling with coffee. On the bench outside, a group of older men sat chatting. But as William stepped out of his car, their conversation came to an abrupt halt. Their eyes shifted to him, studying him with a quiet intensity. Pulling his baseball cap lower over his face, William shielded his expression. He wore a worn leather jacket and faded jeans, intentionally dressing down to blend in. He knew that to understand this place, he needed to observe first before revealing who he was. The doorbell jingled sharply as he stepped into the diner. Instead of a warm greeting, he felt the shift in the atmosphere. The low hum of conversations at the tables stopped. Every eye in the room turned to him, not with curiosity or friendliness, but with unease and caution. An older man at the counter slowly folded his newspaper, raising an eyebrow as he looked William up and down. Near the window, a group of women whispered among themselves, not even trying to hide the fact that he was the subject of their murmurs. William remained composed, walking to the counter. A young waitress with her hair tied in a high ponytail approached him hesitantly. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" she asked politely, though her cautious gaze betrayed her discomfort. "Black coffee, please," William replied calmly but firmly. He knew that any sign of weakness in a place like this would invite disrespect. As he waited, he let his eyes wander around the diner, soaking in the atmosphere. The walls were adorned with old photographs of the town, a small schoolhouse, a tall church steeple, and a parade from the 1950s. In the corner, William's attention landed on two men he immediately recognized, Jack Peterson and Mark Harris. Both were in uniform. Jack, with blonde hair and a cocky smirk, leaned back in his chair with an air of self-satisfaction, while Mark, larger and more intimidating, leaned in to whisper something that made both of them laugh. Even though they weren't speaking loudly, William had no doubt he was the subject of their amusement. "Look at that," Jack said louder, clearly intending for everyone to hear. "Looks like we've got someone who's lost their way." William didn't react. He took the cup of coffee the waitress handed him, a subtle nod from her suggesting she wanted to warn him about something, then turned to leave. Without saying a word, he walked out the door. But as he stepped outside, he could still feel Jack and Mark's mocking stares burning into his back, their silent challenge hanging in the air. Outside, William paused and took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp morning air. His thoughts drifted to his past. He recalled the early days of his career, working in a city where prejudice wasn't hidden. The condescending looks, the biting comments, the isolation from his peers. It was nothing new to him. He remembered one moment in particular, back when he was just a young officer. A colleague had bluntly told him, "William, you'll never be one of us. You know why." Instead of breaking under those words, William had used them as fuel. "I don't need their acceptance to do what's right," he had told himself. Those memories had shaped him, toughened him, and prepared him for this moment. They reminded him why he had taken this job in Fairhope, despite knowing the challenges that lay ahead. As he looked down the main street, lined with small shops and aging diners, a breeze carried the musty scent of old buildings. At that moment, one thought crystallized in his mind. They may see me as an outsider now, but they won't forget me when I leave. This town is about to change, whether they like it or not. With that determination, William returned to his car, ready to face what lay ahead. He hadn't come to Fairhope just to take on a job. He'd come to fight for justice. William returned to the diner that morning, not to seek conversation, but to observe more deeply the people and atmosphere of this town. He knew that to understand a community, there was no better place than a cafe, a space where daily stories were shared and people revealed their true selves. For him, this wasn't just a tactical move. It was a deliberate step to confront those who had already shown him their disdain. The familiar jingle of the doorbell echoed as William stepped inside. Once again, the room froze. Conversations halted abruptly, and every gaze turned to him, from the tables near the windows to the counter at the back. This time, William could feel a sharper tension in the air. The curiosity in their stares was now tinged with hostility. Jack Peterson and Mark Harris were still seated in their corner, their coffee cups nearly empty. Jack leaned back in his chair, toying with his cup, while Mark lounged casually, a smug grin plastered on his face. Though the two were chatting, William could sense that they were tracking his every move. He walked to the counter, removed his cap, and said, "A black coffee, please." His voice was calm and steady, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Emily, the young waitress from the day before, nodded quickly and poured his coffee. When she handed it to him, her hand trembled slightly, betraying a nervousness she couldn't hide. "Good morning," she said quietly, placing the cup in front of him. Her eyes darted briefly toward Jack and Mark before returning to William. Leaning in slightly, she whispered, "I think you should leave soon. Jack and Mark, they aren't the kind of people you want to cross. If they see you as a problem, they won't let it go." William raised an eyebrow, holding her gaze for a moment. He could hear the concern in her voice. Concern not only for him, but possibly for herself as well. "Thank you," he replied softly, his expression calm and unreadable. "I'll handle it." Emily hesitated as if wanting to say more, but she eventually retreated behind the counter, her unease palpable. William sipped his coffee, noting how the silence in the room broke with Jack's booming laughter. His voice was deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at him, Mark," Jack said with mockery. "He looks like someone who's lost his way and doesn't know where he belongs." Mark roared with laughter, slapping his hand on the table. "Maybe he thinks this is some kind of retreat. But I bet he's about to find out it's not. William didn't react. He sat upright, his gaze fixed on the window, while his ears caught every word. I'm not ignoring them out of fear, he thought, but because people like them reveal their weaknesses when they think they're in control. Jack, emboldened by the lack of response, pushed back his chair and stood up, carrying his coffee cup. His heavy footsteps across the wooden floor echoed like a challenge. Mark followed a few steps behind, smirking as he trailed Jack. Jack stopped in front of William's table, leaning down with an air of arrogance. "Where are you from?" he asked, his voice loud enough to fill the room. "I haven't seen you around here, and honestly, you don't look like someone who belongs here." William looked up, his gaze steady and deep, like the ocean before a storm. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice calm but unflinching. Jack chuckled derisively, resting a hand on the table and leaning in closer. "Passing through, huh? This isn't the kind of place people pass through, friend. This is the kind of place where people stay, if they're allowed." Emily, still behind the counter, watched with wide, worried eyes. She wanted to intervene but couldn't summon the courage. She had seen what Jack and Mark were capable of when they didn't like someone. Her only hope was that William would choose to leave before things escalated. What she didn't realize was that William wasn't the kind of man to walk away. Placing his coffee cup down deliberately, William met Jack's gaze. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice steady and firm. "But I'm not avoiding it either." For a brief moment, Jack faltered, caught off guard by the quiet confidence in William's tone. But he quickly recovered, his smirk returning. "Listen, pal," Jack said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Take my advice. Find another road to travel. This isn't a place for people like you." William didn't reply, but his piercing gaze spoke volumes. "This isn't over." Mark clapped Jack on the shoulder. "Come on, Jack. He's not worth it," he said with a chuckle. Jack sneered, turning away, but not before pointing a finger at William. "Remember what I said, friend. Don't make us remind you again." William watched them return to their table, unshaken. They think they've won, but they don't know who I am. They have no idea what I've faced to get here, but they'll learn soon enough. Standing up, William left a few bills on the table for the coffee and walked out of the diner. As the door closed behind him, he knew this was only the beginning. The real confrontation was yet to come, and he was ready for it. The next morning, William woke as a thin veil of mist lingered outside, soft light filtering through the curtains to bring faint warmth to the bare room. He tied his shoelaces and slipped on his worn running shoes, ready for his daily ritual, a run to clear his mind and organize his thoughts. Stepping outside, the cool morning air jolted his senses awake. The narrow dirt roads stretched ahead, winding into the dense woods at the edge of the town. Taking a deep breath, William absorbed the stillness, a deceptive tranquility, for he knew beneath the surface lay undercurrents of prejudice and scorn. William jogged steadily along the dirt road, his steps creating a rhythmic cadence against the ground. As he ventured deeper into the secluded area near the woods, the hum of a vehicle engine broke the stillness. A police cruiser appeared, creeping along behind him. Glancing into the rearview mirror of the car, William recognized the two familiar faces, Jack Peterson and Mark Harris. The car pulled up alongside him, moving at a crawl to match his pace. Mark, in the driver's seat, honked the horn, an obvious attempt to provoke him. William kept running, though he slowed slightly, his expression calm and measured. "Good morning, runner," Jack's mocking voice called out from the window. "Looks like you've wandered onto the wrong path." William remained silent, maintaining his steady pace. The car edged closer, nearly forcing him toward the side of the road. Mark leaned out of the driver's side window, raising his voice. "You sure you're allowed to run here? This isn't exactly a tourist trail, pal." William stopped, exhaling evenly after the long stretch of running. He turned to face the two men in the cruiser, his gaze unwavering. "Just out for a morning jog," he replied evenly. "I didn't realize that was against the law." Mark put the car in park with a loud, deliberate clunk, stepping out as if to emphasize his authority. Jack followed, and together they approached William. Mark's imposing frame blocked the path ahead, his arms crossed over his chest. "Not illegal," he said with thinly veiled disdain, "but around here we have our own rules, and I'm not sure you understand them." "Your own rules?" William raised an eyebrow, his voice calm. "Such as?" Jack stepped forward, his smirk widening. "We don't usually encourage strangers to wander around without a clear reason," he said, eyeing William up and down with faux scrutiny. "I think we ought to check what you're carrying, just to make sure everything's in order." Before William could respond, Jack reached out, patting down his jacket pockets in an invasive and unnecessary display of authority. William remained composed, standing still as Jack rifled through his belongings. Though he didn't resist, his unflinching gaze remained locked on Jack, his calm demeanor sending a clear message. "You can't intimidate me." Jack's hands stopped as he pulled out a small plastic card from William's jacket pocket, holding it up dramatically like he had uncovered something incriminating. Well, what do we have here?" Jack said mockingly. "This yours? Or did you pick it up somewhere along the way?" Mark laughed loudly, the sound grating in the still morning air. "Maybe it's his ticket back to wherever he came from," Mark jeered, locking eyes with William. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should go back to where you belong, if you know what's good for you." William's piercing gaze met Mark's, unwavering. After a long, tense silence, he spoke, his voice steady and unshakable. "I'll be here for a long time." The unexpected conviction in William's words caused both men to falter momentarily. Mark furrowed his brow, but Jack's arrogant smirk quickly returned. "Oh, we'll make sure you get used to the rules around here," Jack said, his voice laced with menace. Without another word, Jack and Mark grabbed William's arms, pulling him toward the patrol car. William didn't resist, letting them lead him. In his mind, one thought repeated, "Let them dig their graves. They don't know what they're doing." They shoved William into the back seat of the cruiser, slamming the door shut. Through the rearview mirror, William watched the two men exchange self-satisfied smirks in front of the car. Unbeknownst to them, the man they were trying to humiliate would soon hold their futures in his hands. Sitting quietly in the back seat, William stared straight ahead, calm and resolute. The real battle had only just begun. The patrol car rolled into the town square, the heart of Fairhope, flanked by aging shops and a modest post office. This was where the town gathered, where deals were struck, gossip exchanged, and lives intertwined. That morning, the square was bustling with activity. Locals mingled, sipping coffee or chatting by their old pickup trucks. William sat silently in the back seat, his hands cuffed in front of him. His outward calm belied a sharp awareness of the unfolding situation. The judgmental stares from the townsfolk, tinged with curiosity and disdain, were all too familiar. But this time, William didn't feel shame. He felt a quiet, burning determination. The car stopped in the middle of the square. Jack and Mark climbed out, their smug expressions brimming with misplaced pride. Jack opened the car door, roughly pulling William out. Mark joined, laughing as he gestured toward the center of the square. "Let's give the town a little show," he said. They dragged William toward a large lamppost at the square's center. Slowly, the bustling activity ground to a halt as curious onlookers turned to watch. Some froze in place, while others slipped away, unwilling to get involved. A few younger residents pulled out their phones, recording or live streaming the spectacle. Older townsfolk watched from a distance, their expressions a mix of discomfort and silent disapproval. Among them was Mr. Carter, an elderly man near the post office, who crossed his arms and shook his head subtly, unwilling to speak out but unable to hide his displeasure. Mark grabbed a length of rope from the patrol car, while Jack pressed William against the lamppost with calculated deliberation, ensuring every move was witnessed. "All right, folks," Jack declared loudly, his voice carrying across the square. "Today's lesson: don't trespass where you don't belong." Mark smirked, slapping William's shoulder as he tied the rope. "This is Fairhope's way of welcoming strangers," he said with a sneer. "And this man needs the reminder." William remained silent. He didn't look at Jack or Mark. Instead, his gaze swept across the crowd. A few townsfolk seemed visibly uncomfortable, yet none of them moved or spoke up. Near the post office stood an older man, Mr. Carter, arms crossed over his chest. He shook his head slightly, his face marked by disapproval. But he stayed quiet. Mr. Carter had lived here long enough to know that standing up to people like Jack and Mark was either futile or dangerous. "We've got ourselves a lost soul," Jack continued, his voice booming across the square, "and I guarantee that after today, he'll think twice before stopping somewhere he doesn't belong." A few weak chuckles rippled through the crowd, not from genuine amusement, but from the oppressive tension in the air. Others stayed silent, their eyes shifting uneasily between William and the two officers. Some younger bystanders held up their phones, recording or even live streaming the spectacle for their social media followers. William stood tall, his posture unwavering, his expression calm. Inside, however, his thoughts were razor sharp. He knew this was the moment for Jack and Mark to expose themselves. "They think they're humiliating me," he thought, "but all they're doing is digging their own grave. Let them keep going." Mark stepped closer, his gaze boring into William's face. "Got anything to say for yourself, buddy?" he sneered. "Or do you already know you don't belong here?" William locked eyes with Mark, unflinching. "I don't need to say anything," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I'll let my actions speak for me." Jack let out a derisive laugh, clapping Mark on the shoulder. "Hear that, Mark? He thinks he's going to do something. That's hilarious." But as they stared into William's eyes, both men couldn't completely hide a fleeting flicker of doubt. There was something about him, a quiet strength and conviction that they couldn't break. Still, their arrogance masked any hesitation, and they continued their performance. Meanwhile, the videos recorded by the crowd began surfacing on social media. Live streams captured the entire incident, and comments began flooding in. "What's going on with this man? This is how they treat strangers here? Are these cops or thugs?" The bystanders filming had no idea that their small actions would soon ignite a firestorm of outrage, turning this small-town spectacle into a national conversation. As the scene reached its peak, Jack and Mark returned to their patrol car, leaving William tied tightly to the lamppost in the middle of the square. From a distance, they laughed and joked, basking in the attention of the crowd. William, even in this moment of public humiliation, stood tall. His icy gaze, unyielding and sharp, carried the weight of someone who knew his worth. In truth, it wasn't William who was on display. It was Jack and Mark who were revealing their true nature for all to see, both in the square and beyond. William knew this was only the beginning, but he also knew that the spectacle wouldn't last long. Enjoy this moment, he thought, because by tomorrow, everything will change. The morning in Fairhope carried the same air of serene familiarity, but online, a storm was brewing. Videos of Jack and Mark tying William to the lamppost had gone viral, spreading across social media platforms with astonishing speed. Thousands of shares, comments, and waves of outrage ignited a digital firestorm. On a local forum, the first post titled, "Is This How Police Treat Strangers in Fairhope?" featured a nearly 2-minute video of William standing tall, tied to the lamppost, while Jack and Mark mocked him in front of a crowd. The comments poured in relentlessly. How can a police officer do this? Who is this man? He doesn't look like a vagrant or troublemaker. This is shameful. The town needs answers immediately. This is why people don't trust the police anymore. Within hours, larger accounts began picking up the story, amplifying the outrage. One prominent account dedicated to analyzing social issues posted, "Police in Fairhope humiliate a stranger. This demands investigation." The video views skyrocketed, shares multiplied, and by mid-morning, the hashtag #YaJusticeForTheStranger was trending across platforms. Meanwhile, in a newsroom in the nearby city, journalist Lisa Brown received an alert about the story. Sitting at her desk, she watched the viral video intently, reading through the furious comments. It didn't take long for Lisa to realize this wasn't just a small-town incident. It was a story that could explode into a nationwide scandal. Wasting no time, Lisa grabbed her camera and microphone and headed straight for Fairhope. When she arrived at the town square, everything seemed to have returned to normal on the surface. But the quiet unease in the air told another story. Locals were gathered, chatting in subdued tones, their gazes wary as Lisa's car pulled in. Stepping out with her gear in hand, Lisa began interviewing anyone willing to talk. "Excuse me, sir. Do you know what happened here yesterday?" she asked a middle-aged man sitting near the post office. The man shook his head, unwilling to respond. But when Lisa approached Mr. Carter, he paused for a long moment before sighing. "I saw what they did," he said softly. "That's not how we should treat anyone, no matter who they are." Sensing the weight in his words, Lisa pressed gently. "Do you think their actions were justified?" Mr. Carter shook his head firmly. "No, but around here, people are scared. No one speaks up. They've done things like this before, but I've never seen them go this far, not with someone like him." "Who is he?" Lisa asked, her curiosity piqued. But Mr. Carter simply shook his head again, unwilling or unable to say more. Lisa continued her interviews, but most responses were vague or evasive. However, through hushed whispers and careful observations, she pieced together a troubling narrative. Jack and Mark had a history of abusing their authority, and yesterday's incident with William was only the tipping point. Standing in the center of the square, Lisa prepared to go live. With the microphone in hand and her camera rolling, she began, "Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Brown, reporting from Fairhope, the small town where a video that has shaken the internet was filmed yesterday. In this footage, 2 police officers are seen tying a man to a lamppost in the middle of town and mocking him in front of a crowd. My question is this: is this how Fairhope treats outsiders? And more importantly, who is this man? I'll be following this story closely and sharing updates as they come." At the Fairhope police station, tension was brewing, though Jack and Mark remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them. Lounging in the break room, they laughed about their achievement, oblivious to the growing outrage online. They couldn't have imagined that their actions were hours away from spiraling beyond their control. Meanwhile, in the quiet of his room, William sat watching the posts and videos circulating online. He read the comments, observed the growing momentum, and saw how the story was spreading like wildfire. These videos were no longer just records of injustice. They were weapons of truth. They've done this to themselves, he thought, his expression calm but resolute. And now, I'll use it to bring about change. As the day progressed, William knew the time to act had come. Pulling out his pristine police chief uniform, he prepared for what would come next. This time, when he faced Jack and Mark, it wouldn't be as a stranger. It would be as their superior. With his badge gleaming on his chest and determination in his eyes, William knew this was the moment to take back control. Not just for himself, but for the community and the principles of justice he stood for. The following morning, William stood before the mirror, adjusting the crisp police chief uniform that now bore his name. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the badge on his chest, making it gleam, a symbol of authority and integrity. His face remained calm, but his piercing eyes reflected determination. Today wasn't just another day on the job. Today, he would reshape the narrative in Fairhope. The police station, a small brick building in the heart of town, seemed unremarkable from the outside. Inside, the usual morning lethargy hung in the air. Officers shuffled papers, sipped coffee, and exchanged idle chatter. Jack and Mark, as usual, were seated in the corner, laughing loudly as they recounted the events of the day before. "Did you see the way he just stood there? Pathetic," Jack said, leaning back in his chair, laughing. "I bet he won't dare show his face here again." Mark smirked, nodding. "It'll be a long time before anyone even thinks about challenging us in this town." Their laughter was abruptly cut short as the main door swung open. William entered, his police chief uniform commanding attention. The room fell silent. Papers stopped shuffling, conversations ceased, and the atmosphere shifted dramatically. William strode purposefully into the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over everyone present. The officers exchanged confused looks, some recognizing him as the man humiliated in the town square the previous day. A young officer fumbled and dropped a stack of papers, while another whispered hurriedly to his colleague. The tension in the room was palpable. Jack and Mark froze, their smug expressions replaced with shock. Jack shot to his feet, his voice faltering. Who are you? What are you doing here?" William stopped in the center of the room, his silence cutting through the air like a blade. He let the moment linger, the weight of his presence pressing down on the two men. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm the man you should never have crossed." The meeting room was thick with tension, as if the air itself had turned oppressive. The officers stood silently, their eyes fixed on Jack and Mark. Both men were visibly struggling to maintain their composure, but their unease was impossible to hide. William remained composed, his steely gaze fixed on them. "I think it's time for some clarity," he said, his voice calm but commanding. He held up his phone, playing the now viral video of the incident in the town square. The sound of Jack and Mark's mocking laughter echoed through the room, followed by the image of William tied to the lamppost. The room fell into a heavy silence. Several officers looked visibly uncomfortable, while others hung their heads, avoiding the screen altogether. William looked up, his gaze sweeping the room. "This," he said, gesturing to the video, "is what two of your colleagues have done. They didn't just humiliate me, they humiliated this uniform and the values it represents." Jack, attempting to salvage his confidence, straightened up and stammered, "Sir, it was just a joke. A town tradition. Nothing meant to harm anyone." William's expression hardened, his tone sharp. "A tradition?" he repeated. "What kind of tradition allows you to publicly degrade another human being, to insult them in front of the community, without a second thought for the consequences? What tradition teaches you that this is acceptable?" Mark tried to intervene. "We didn't think it was that serious. It was just a way to control outsiders, to remind them that this isn't a place they can do whatever they want." William stepped closer, his gaze unflinching. "And you think you have the authority to do that? Do you think the badge on your chest gives you the right to bully and trample on others? Let me make this clear. Tradition never excuses disrespect." The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, some beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. One older officer, Sergeant Daniels, nodded subtly in agreement with William's words. With decades of service under his belt, Daniels understood the damage actions like Jack and Mark's could inflict, not just on the police force's reputation, but on the trust of the community. Turning to address the entire room, William's voice was resolute. "I will not allow anyone in this department to tarnish the honor of this profession. We are not just enforcers of the law. We are protectors of respect and fairness. If any of you feel you cannot uphold those values, the door is right there." Jack and Mark were now visibly shaken, their bravado gone. Jack stared at the floor, unable to meet William's eyes, while Mark fidgeted nervously, glancing around the room as if searching for support. None came. William continued, his tone unwavering. "From today onward, any behavior that disrespects others, abuses power, or humiliates anyone will have no place in this department. And to set an example, Jack Peterson and Mark Harris, you will be held accountable for your actions." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but William raised a hand, silencing him. "No more excuses. I've seen enough." Walking to the table, William placed 2 reports in front of Jack and Mark. "These are formal notices of suspension. Effective immediately, you are both relieved of your duties pending an internal investigation into your abuse of power." The room was utterly silent. Jack and Mark stood motionless, their faces pale. William met their eyes one last time and said firmly, "This town may have turned a blind eye in the past, but from now on, things will be different." Turning on his heel, William left the room, leaving an air of finality behind him. He knew this wasn't just a punishment for 2 officers. It was a statement to the entire force. Change had arrived, and there would be no room for those unwilling to adapt. As William stepped outside, the morning sunlight caught the badge on his chest once more. For the first time, he felt the weight of justice shift, not for himself, but for the responsibility he carried to restore fairness and dignity to his department. This was only the beginning of a long journey. But William was ready for the road ahead. The tension in the police department was palpable after William announced the suspension of Jack and Mark. Every breath seemed louder, the air heavier, as the implications of his decision settled over the room. But William wasn't done. He knew that to rebuild trust within the community and among his team, decisive action was necessary. The next morning, William convened the entire force in the main meeting room. Standing at the head of the table, his uniform impeccable, the badge on his chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights, William commanded the attention of everyone present. The officers sat silently, exchanging uneasy glances. At the far end of the table, Jack and Mark sat, their faces pale and drawn, as if they already knew what was coming. William let the silence linger, his gaze sweeping the room before he spoke, his voice steady and resolute. "I made my position clear from the moment I walked into this building," he began. I will not tolerate any behavior that undermines the honor of this department or the trust of the community we serve. I trust every one of you shares that commitment." His eyes locked on Jack and Mark, the weight of his words settling heavily. "Jack Peterson, Mark Harris, your actions violated the core principles of this profession: ethics, respect, and responsibility. What you did was not just an attack on an individual, it was an attack on the trust our community has placed in us." Jack shifted in his seat, attempting to protest, but William raised a hand, silencing him. "No more excuses," William said sharply. "The entire town has seen what you did. Your actions have gone viral, and this is no longer a matter of a so-called tradition or a harmless joke. It's a disgrace to the badge." William placed 2 termination papers on the table in front of him. His voice rang clear. "As of today, Jack Peterson and Mark Harris, you are both terminated, effective immediately. Hand over your badges and weapons and leave this department now." The room was deathly silent. Jack bowed his head, his jaw clenched tightly, his eyes avoiding William and his colleagues. Mark, who was usually brash and overconfident, sat frozen, gripping the edge of his chair. No one spoke up in their defense. William's cold gaze bore into them. "Let this be a lesson for all of you. We are not just enforcers of the law. We are stewards of dignity, fairness, and justice. Those who cannot uphold these values have no place here." Jack rose slowly, his movements heavy with resignation. He removed his badge, placing it on the table with an audible clink. Mark followed, his hands trembling slightly as he added his badge next to Jack's. There was no defiance, no anger, only the quiet humiliation of 2 men who had lost everything. As they walked toward the door, the other officers watched in silence. Some exchanged glances of relief, others of guilt, realizing they had failed to speak up sooner. The hallway seemed longer than ever as Jack and Mark made their exit. Other staff members averted their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge the disgraced officers. The station doors creaked open, and they stepped outside into the bright morning light, leaving behind the arrogance and authority they had once wielded. Outside, a small crowd of townsfolk had gathered, curious to witness the fallout. Among them stood Emily, the young waitress from the diner. She watched intently as Jack and Mark walked away, their heads bowed. When they disappeared from view, she turned to William, who had stepped outside moments later. Her voice wavered with emotion as she said, "Justice has finally been served." William gave her a small nod, his expression firm but reflective. "Justice isn't just about removing them," he said quietly. "It's about rebuilding trust. That's the real work." Emily smiled faintly, hope shimmering in her eyes. "This town has waited a long time. We need someone like you." William said nothing, simply nodding in acknowledgement. As he stepped back into the station, he knew that while Jack and Mark were gone, the work of repairing the department's reputation and relationship with the community was only beginning. After Jack and Mark were dismissed, the story didn't end. Instead, it felt like it was just beginning. The video of their actions continued to ignite outrage online, catching the attention of the district attorney's office. Soon, years of misconduct by the 2 former officers began to surface, dragging their buried secrets into the light. A few days after the incident, the district attorney's office announced a formal investigation into Jack and Mark's history of abuse. The announcement spread rapidly through Fairhope, sparking a new wave of courage among past victims who began stepping forward to share their stories. The office was flooded with complaints in just a few days. Clerks worked tirelessly to document the statements of those who had suffered in silence for years. A middle-aged man recounted being berated by Mark in front of his family for a minor parking violation. An elderly woman described how Jack had threatened her during a land dispute, leveraging his badge as a tool of intimidation. The most harrowing testimony came from Sarah, a young woman who had been bullied and humiliated by Jack years ago. Her account became the focal point of a public trial that drew the attention of the entire town. In the courtroom, Sarah walked to the witness stand, her face tense, but her gaze unwavering. She gripped the microphone tightly, pausing for a deep breath before speaking. 3 years ago, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I was driving home when I was stopped by Jack Peterson. At first, I thought it was just a routine traffic check, but then he started questioning me aggressively. He told me I didn't belong in this town and that I should go back to where I came from. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she pushed forward, her eyes locking on the jury. I felt terrified and humiliated, especially since he did it in front of passing drivers. I said nothing because I was afraid that speaking up would make things worse. But today, I'm here to say that this kind of behavior can't continue. No one deserves to be treated like this. The courtroom fell silent. The only sound was the faint scratch of the clerk's pen. Sarah's story left many visibly emotional, even those who had once accepted Jack and Mark's behavior as part of the town's traditions. After Sarah's testimony, William was called to the stand. Dressed in his police chief uniform, he stood tall and confident, his voice firm as he addressed the court. What you just heard is not just Sarah's story, William began, his tone steady. It's the story of many people in this community who have suffered because of actions that should never have happened, especially not by those sworn to protect them. He paused, scanning the room, letting his words sink in. We cannot undo the past. The pain and damage caused by Jack and Mark are permanent scars on this town, but we can ensure that it never happens again. Turning toward the Fairhope residents in attendance, his voice carried a note of hope. I believe Fairhope can be better. We can become a community that is not just safe, but just and honorable, a place we can all take pride in. But this change can only happen if we all stand together and demand better. The trial lasted the entire day, and by the end, the verdict was clear. Jack and Mark were convicted of abuse of power and faced serious penalties. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office continued its investigation into additional allegations against them. William and his restructured police team committed to addressing the department's past mistakes, initiating reforms to rebuild trust with the community. Outside the courthouse, Sarah approached William, her face a mix of relief and gratitude. Thank you for standing up for us, she said softly, her sincerity shining through. William nodded, his voice calm but resolute. This wasn't just me, Sarah. It's because of people like you, people brave enough to speak out. But there's still more work to do. The atmosphere outside the courthouse was heavy with emotion. Townsfolk lingered, watching the quiet conversation between William and Sarah, recognizing the significance of the moment. A few nodded respectfully toward William, their faces reflecting newfound trust and hope. Sarah placed her hand gently on William's arm, her eyes firm with determination. We'll stand with you. This isn't just your fight, it's ours too, and we won't let you do it alone. William offered a small smile, but inside he knew her words weren't just encouragement. They were a promise from a community ready to rebuild itself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the small town in hues of gold and crimson, Fairhope seemed to radiate a new energy, a feeling of renewal. For the first time in years, the townspeople believed that change was not only possible, but already underway. Standing on the courthouse steps, William gazed out over the crowd. He could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but he also felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just about Jack and Mark. It was about changing the culture of silence and complicity that had allowed their actions to persist for so long. This is only the beginning, he thought, already envisioning the hard work that lay ahead. Community meetings, policy reforms, and building bridges between the police and the people they served. But his resolve burned bright as he considered the future. Fairhope was turning the page to a new chapter, one of justice, accountability, and unity. While not everyone was convinced that change would come quickly, William knew the seeds had been planted. And as those seeds began to grow, nothing could stop the force of a community that had found its voice. After the historic trial, a wave of transformation began sweeping through Fairhope. The testimonies of victims like Sarah not only fueled outrage, but also sparked a newfound spirit of unity in the community. Residents who had long stayed silent out of fear or apathy now stood together with a shared goal: reforming the system and rebuilding trust in law enforcement. The town square, once the site of William's public humiliation, became a gathering place for progress. Peaceful protests were held weekly under the gentle morning sun. Hundreds of residents gathered, holding signs that read, "Respect for all," "Justice for everyone," and "We deserve better." Children walked hand in hand with their parents. Elderly citizens stood alongside young activists, and voices joined in a calm but powerful chorus. The slogans they chanted resonated not with anger, but with resolve. This wasn't a protest of destruction. It was a movement of reconstruction. Emily, the young waitress from the cafe, stood at the front of one gathering, a small megaphone in hand. Her voice was steady as she addressed the crowd. "This town used to accept silence, but not anymore. We're not asking for anything extraordinary, just respect. Every person here deserves to be treated as a human being." Her words were met with resounding applause. In the front row, Mr. Carter, the elderly man who had witnessed so much injustice in his lifetime, held a small sign that read simply, "Proud of Fairhope." William, as police chief, didn't stop with the dismissal of Jack and Mark. He initiated sweeping reforms within the police department. Regular training sessions on ethics and crisis management were established, and new officers were carefully selected, not just for their skills, but for their empathy and commitment to serving the community. One early morning, William held an open forum in the town square, inviting residents to share their concerns and ideas directly with the police force. Standing on a small stage, he listened attentively to each question and comment. An older woman raised her voice from the crowd. "How can we know this won't happen again?" William responded with sincerity, his voice firm yet compassionate. "I can't promise perfection overnight," he admitted, "but I can promise this. We will work every day to ensure fairness and safety for everyone in this town. And if anyone, myself included, falls short, you have the right to hold us accountable." As the late afternoon sun bathed the square in golden light, the crowd began to disperse, their spirits lifted by the meeting's transparency and resolve. Mr. Carter lingered, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his well-worn coat, watching as families and groups of friends gradually disappeared into the quiet streets. His eyes carried the weight of memories, playing like a film in his mind. He remembered when the square was a symbol of silence. Injustices played out openly, yet no one dared to act. Avoided gazes, bowed heads, and the pervasive grip of fear had once defined this place. Not long ago, he had believed such things were unchangeable, part of Fairhope's inevitable fate. But now, the scene before him was entirely different. Children ran across the cobblestone paths, their laughter filling the air like a song of renewal. Groups of young adults stood in animated discussions, brainstorming ways to further improve their town. In one corner, newly recruited police officers chatted warmly with residents, their demeanor one of genuine care and responsibility. Emily approached Mr. Carter, her steps light and her smile radiant. "What do you think, Mr. Carter? Our town is finally changing," she said, her voice filled with a mix of joy and humility. He turned to her, his eyes soft but thoughtful. After a pause, he nodded, a faint smile breaking across his weathered face. "I've lived here my whole life," he began, his voice deliberate and clear. "There were times I thought nothing would ever change. Many times I doubted, lost faith even. But today, for the first time, I feel proud of this town." Emily fell silent, moved by the gravity of his words. "We've come a long way," she said softly, "but this is just the beginning." Mr. Carter nodded again. "Yes, it is. Change is never easy. But when I see the hope in these young people's faces, when I hear the laughter of children on this square, I know we're on the right path." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the square quieted, bathed in the gentle hues of twilight. A soft breeze carried the sweet scent of a new season, and Mr. Carter inhaled deeply, savoring a tranquility he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he believed in the future of Fairhope. Though the road ahead would be long, the town had found its guiding light. Emily turned toward him, her eyes gleaming. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Without people like you, this town wouldn't have risen." He shook his head with a gentle laugh. "The thanks don't belong to me. They belong to everyone who refuses to stop believing in change. They're the reason today is possible." It was a lively weekend afternoon, and Fairhope buzzed with a new energy. The town square, once a symbol of silence and injustice, had transformed into a hub of life and renewal. Residents worked together to repaint old buildings, install new benches, and plant trees along the pathways. The sound of laughter and chatter mingled with the clink of tools, creating an atmosphere filled with hope. William stood outside the police station, watching the scene unfold. He saw families working side by side, children running freely, and his newly recruited officers helping to carry supplies. This was the vision he had dreamed of when he took the job. A community not just surviving, but thriving through respect and unity. Emily approached him, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Do you see it?" she asked, her voice gentle but full of joy. "This town is changing, and it's all thanks to you." William accepted the coffee with a small smile. "I didn't do this alone," he replied, his eyes scanning the crowd. "They are the real strength. I just helped them realize it." Emily looked at him, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "You've inspired them to believe again, and that's no small feat." Taking a sip of coffee, William breathed in deeply, then turned to Emily. "This is just the beginning," he said, his tone steady but humble. "Rebuilding trust takes time and effort from everyone." Emily nodded, her smile unwavering. "Then, I guess we'll have to keep working together." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the town in warm hues of gold and orange, William strolled toward the square. He stopped to greet residents, shaking hands with an elderly man repainting the wall of an old cafe and patting a young officer on the shoulder as they helped rebuild the park fence. Pausing in the middle of the square, William surveyed the scene. He spotted Mr. Carter standing beneath a large, ancient tree, talking with a group of teenagers. The older man's laughter and nods reflected his satisfaction, as though he was finally seeing a long-held dream come true. In another corner, Sarah and a group of women arranged fresh flowers around the fountain, their voices filled with purpose and pride. Standing there, William felt warmth spread through his chest. He knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but today, Fairhope had shown it could change, and change for the better. Turning back toward the police station, William paused for a moment, as though capturing the scene in his memory. He thought about those early days, the scrutinizing gazes, the harsh words, and the resistance that seemed insurmountable. Now, things were different. Fairhope was no longer a town shackled by fear and injustice, but one learning to trust and respect. He reminded himself, justice isn't a destination, it's a journey, and I'm here to make sure we never lose our way. With that, William walked on, leaving behind a community in the midst of rebuilding itself. But he knew Fairhope's heart had changed forever. As the last rays of sunlight bathed the square, William's silhouette blended into the scene, standing as a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Fairhope had transformed, shedding its history of fear and injustice to become a beacon of hope and unity. This story serves as a powerful reminder that every individual has the strength to change their community when they stand for justice. What do you think of William's journey? Do you have a story of positive change in your community? Share it in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to discover more inspiring stories like this one. See you in the next video.